Hey guys, Palsteron here, and today let's talk about mana and mana cost specifically. A variable that we all kind of have to engage with our builds, some more, some less. But yeah, turns out casting your main skill is actually pretty damn valuable, and running out of mana feels really bad. This didn't used to be an issue, and it used to be something that was easily fixed with Leech, Mana Flasks, EB. But GGG has kind of thrown a little bit of a wrench in that, and if you are league starting Archmage and you're still playing Archmage, you might be wondering, what is he talking about? Are you playing like Hex Blast with Blood Magic? So yeah, we're gonna start out with what happened, then we're gonna talk about why cheesing mana is actually so goddamn good. I'm gonna give you an example from this build right here that I'm currently setting up. It's kind of like a ward caster right side. It's a little bit experimental, it might be completely shit, we'll see. Then how to cheese mana, problematic archetypes, and maybe some changes I would propose. So what happened in the last two leagues? In 3.24, the 25% reduced mana cost that you could get from a flask is gone. It was a crafted modifier that you could basically get by unveiling Cinder Swallow, and yeah, it just doesn't exist anymore, which is a ridiculous nerf for, first up, Mage Blood, which, to be honest, was pretty broken and is something that probably should have been addressed. But it also nerfed a lot of Pathfinder archetypes and even archetypes that just slapped it onto their normal builds to at least have good uptime on reduced mana cost. TLDR, it was an incredibly strong mod, and some archetypes just ceased to exist because of this change. For example, a lot of the cast on crit builds that are now kind of relegated to either going Archmage or just disappearing. Now, the second nerf was inspiration support, and this is a pretty big deal for builds that already had some amount of reduced mana cost. They now get screwed big time because this 38% used to actually stack additively because it used to say reduced mana cost. And to give you an example right here, let's take a spell that costs 200 mana and it has 30% reduced mana cost just from the passive tree, right? Maybe it has stuff like Tireless on the left side. It has the reduced mana mastery right here. That's already 25%. Maybe you even get more, right? You get Righteous Decree. But the TLDR here is that the old inspiration, this 30% reduced mana cost, would be additive with inspiration, which means you could theoretically get your mana cost to 0 with it, but in this case 70%. That gets the 200 mana to 60 mana. And with the new changes, you first get the 40% less, which gets it to 120, and then the reduced part is only on those 120, which gets it to 84 mana cost. And while this does not look like a game changer, it's often a lot of small changes together that make huge changes. So the 5% reduced mana cost is gone from Jewels. Now, this was not as big of a deal because people just used to take like 1 or 2. Very rarely would you actually see people investing into this, mostly because that's where you get your crit multi or your dot multi from. Mods on Jewels, especially suffixes, are high priority. So it wasn't the biggest deal, but it was something you had at least a chance to use. Another thing that happened last patch is attack-based skills have now increased mana cost. It's not true for all skills, but almost all skills. So they basically normalized how much they cost and made it a little bit more competitive with how extremely expensive spells are. We also have the removal of Divine Blessing. Why that is so important is mainly because of Eldritch Battery. If you look right here, you will see that Eldritch Battery used to be one of the ways to cheese mana, and it always used to get that Divine Blessing, which gives you +1 aura to kind of offset the fact that you cannot use Energy Shield anymore and that you now have to scale Energy Shield. That is also kind of gone, which is a huge nerf for one ways of cheesing mana. And then even further back, we also have the Enduring Mana Flask nerf. Enduring Mana Flasks are still used in stuff like Hex Blast, but that is only because the mines are very cheap. In builds that, for example, take 60 to 70 mana per cast, and they have like, I don't know, 5-6 casts per second, it is basically impossible to do anything with this flask, even if you're willing to give one up. Now, before we even go through how you can sidestep your mana cost completely, I want to quickly talk to you about why this is so important, and especially if you're somebody who's a build maker, you need to know these things, and you need to plan your builds accordingly. Right now, I have a very intricate ward build with Beacon of Madness, which, as you can think, has a lot of weird interactions, and there's a lot of things to fix. But the hardest one to fix was, funnily enough, mana cost. And when I say fix, people always go to, well, you can take this mana cluster and you can take that mana cluster, which is what I want to counter in this video. And I want to give you a little bit of an insight of how costly it is to actually fix your mana. This is as straightforward as it gets, and this is a elemental skill. So this one can use inspiration. So it's actually easier for them to fix mana. So right now, I'm putting 6 passive points into mana. Right here, I have Deep Thoughts with reduced mana cost of skills, and then I have Mind Drinker with the Mana Mastery. For this build, don't ask why. Spell Echo is not very good, so this Mastery is actually incredibly strong. 6 passive points, which would translate in this build to 23% more damage with an extra medium cluster and 2 damage nodes. So far, so good. Then we have 2 prefixes and 1 suffix, and this is basically my ring right here. And this is a very, very strong ring. These are annoying as hell to craft because the hybrid reduced mana cost of skill mana in the prefix you have to hit with a Veiled Orb, which are very expensive. So not only is it hard to fix, it's also expensive. I also need a mana regen roll in the suffix, then I need to catalyze everything, and at the end I even need to craft on non-channeling skills have -8. If you chuck these in, prefixes for caster are actually not that big of a deal. You're missing like a percentage damage roll. The suffix could have been dot multi, so in total, these come out to 9% more damage that I could have gotten otherwise. But be aware that this is with me having to use a rare ring here. I have no option for anything else. Then we have Inspiration, which actually costs me 10% more damage, because if I didn't use that, I could actually use Awaken Spell Echo or Empower or something like that. It's, I think, even a little bit more, but I think this is more normalized. And then we also have Clarity Reservation. I'm reserving Clarity. Right now I'm doing it on life, but it might turn back to mana, in which case I'm losing Herald of Agony, which is a straight up 10% more damage. Multiply all of these with each other, and you're coming out to around about 63% more damage. What I want you to take away from this point here is that think about the skill, the off-meta skill that you loved, you used to play, and now it's not really viable anymore, but it just needs more damage. Think about how good it would be with 63% more damage. Just being able to fix your mana does not mean that you can actually compete with all the other build archetypes that do not need to address mana at all, as you can very clearly see from this example. And this is, by the way, a mild example. I could be a Fizz skill that doesn't convert, or a Chaos spellcaster, and I could not even use Inspiration, and I would probably lose like half of my damage here. But let's talk about how you can cheese mana. The first one is Archmage, which you might say, well, I have to go Cloak of Defiance in my build, I have to go Edziri's Foible and whatnot. But what you have to understand when you say those things, right, is mana nodes and everything that revolves around mana also fixes your defenses and your offenses at the same time. If a Archmage build would have to take Deep Thoughts right here, or Mind Drinker, it would do that anyways because it's already efficient. Now, there are a few nodes that you probably wouldn't take, like this one hanging node here, this one hanging node there, maybe a few other small mana regen nodes that you wouldn't need otherwise, but figuring out your mana kind of goes hand in hand with figuring out your damage and defenses. The second one is Blood Magic, and the reason this is so strong right now is because Eternal Blessing exists. And Eternal Blessing basically gives you a free aura. So it's kind of like, imagine you don't have to take any aura clusters at all. You just reserve one aura. Without Blood Magic, that would be 50% of your mana. So whatever you could do other than that with your mana would maybe be a 25 reservation, 30% reservation. With Blood Magic, you just have that one aura, but now you also completely figured out your mana. This is being used on spellcasters, and it is being used on attack-based builds that are down here anyway as an easy solution, as well as that it also does give 10% more max life. Then we have the Enduring Mana Flask, which makes it so you get, without any scaling, without any extra quality, 104.9 mana regen per second, which is enough for builds like Hexblast. It's enough for other mine builds or maybe some trappers that don't have any problem with mana whatsoever. And yeah, you just slap it on your build. It's -1 flask, and hopefully you're gonna kill whatever before these charges run out. It's not a great solution, but a solution nonetheless. And it, funnily enough, is better on builds that cannot recover their charges consistently, because on those builds, flask slots are not as valuable as on, for example, Pathfinder. Then we have Eldritch Battery, and you might be thinking you haven't seen much of it this league. The first reason why that is that people have now realized just how strong Archmage is for almost any skill. Last league was kind of like the warm-up period for a lot of people. This league, it's come full circle. And the second reason is that Divine Blessing got removed. And this is a big deal because it means that you don't just get a 50% reservation aura for free anymore. That means you lose Zealotry, Wrath, Determination. You're not going to lose your best Reservation Aura, because you already have that anyways. But at the end, you can slap on, for a lot of spellcasters, at the end, maybe like a Zealotry or something. And losing that incentive makes the archetype a lot more questionable. And that's why you're also going to see more and more Tricksters that have been already out, because Trickster can't use EB anyways, and it's one of the biggest winners because of its demise. Then let's talk about attack-based builds, like for example, Lightning Strike, Frostblades, Molten Strike, whatever is meta this league. They got their mana cost increased, like I said earlier. But one of the things they got is they got new clusters. The premier one is right here with Thrill of Battle, 15% reduced mana cost, mana on hit. The small node here is good as well. And the back node is also really strong with 12%. They also have a Mana Mastery right here, which gives you easy access to Reservation if you need it, or even more reduced mana cost. Couple that with the fact that you can easily get a Searing Exarch reduced mana cost right here, which goes up to 30%, which granted means you have to use a rare helmet, but that's not really a big sacrifice for most attack-based builds. And to top this all off, we obviously have Mana Leech. So wherever you get your Mana Leech, maybe you have a 1-pointer here, maybe you're Fizz-based and you can actually get a Synth implicit, maybe you just take this 1-pointer here. Most of them are probably going to take Clever Thief. Once you have a mana cost down to a certain point, Leech just takes over and it's not an issue anymore. Mana cost in a lot of attack-based builds is less of a necessity and more quality of life. Plus, there's also other clusters over here. Spirit of War, which doesn't have the best pathing ever. And then you also have Cannibalistic Rite, which is a little bit better placed. And as I talked about before, especially if you're a Marauder or a Slam build, Blood Magic will come in handy. So what is left here at the end is Non-Archmage Casters, which you might think, ugh, that sounds disgusting. Who the hell would do that? But believe me, there's dozens of us, and there's also the fact that Cast on Crit right now heavily relies on mana because of the changes they made 5, 6, 7 leagues ago, actually, where a lot of that stuff used to be free. They removed a lot of other things. That would be another video to go into completely. But those builds have been bleeding. And what I mean with bleeding, once again, is this example right here. Yes, you can figure it out, but you could also say that, in essence, a lot of these non-Archmage casters are actually nerfed quite significantly. If we invert this potential more damage gained into less damage, we could say that non-Archmage casters right now deal 39% less damage. And I know that's not 100% true, because Archmage, especially after some of the mana nerfs or bug fixes mid-league, has been getting a little bit more competitive. At the end of the day, most of the nodes that you take still feed into it. And even if we give it a little bit of leeway, maybe we say like 30% less damage or whatever, that is still incredible. And one of the premier reasons why Archmage right now is so goddamn strong, why there's so many Hierophants on the ladder, it is just one of the strongest archetypes at the moment. One of the reasons that you should not forget is this mana cost. And this is also kind of to remind you that if that ever should go away, that might stomp a lot of that advantage. So overall, I think what we just talked about is not the end of the world. I don't even know if I like it or hate it. I think it's an interesting decision to make, and it's something they could expand upon. But I have two issues with this. First one is Inspiration is simply too efficient. Now, even though Inspiration got nerfed, if you're trying to fix the mana of, for example, let's say Forbidden Rite, which is a pure Chaos caster, versus something like an elemental skill like I'm doing right here, Rolling Magma, it's a crazy difference. And yes, once again, we could just go back to say, just use this, use that, use one of these cheese methods. But you can't tell me that it's not weird that you have to use one of these things that completely remove mana from the equation instead of actually using the tools that were given, right? The reduced mana cost, the mana regen. It just all feels too inefficient. If this was the same across the board, sure, but it just isn't. It completely stomps Chaos and Fizz-based casters. Most Fizz builds, believe it or not, there would be more Fizz builds and more Chaos casters if Inspiration was, for example, global, or there was way easier ways to reduce mana. And the second thing that always has existed is this weird gap between spellcasters and attack-based builds. And that just comes down to Mana Leech. Mana Leech is a joke. If you think it isn't, you take 0.1% Mana Leech on a Symph Jewel, and you basically cap the mana. I don't even know why these Mana Leech nodes exist, like as if anybody's gonna take Spirit Void or Essence Sap. I mean, there's very, very, very small amount of builds that would ever even take this, but let's be real, like we all know it's a 1-point fix. And then you have casters which have this massive burden. I'm not really sure what that's about. I guess their thought for this design choice is that it's just not very easy to get a lot of mana in the bottom side, or I don't know, right side of the tree. So we're gonna have less mana, so naturally less mana regen. So let's just give them a free card. I'm not really sure what it is. Either way, these are incredibly big rifts between those archetypes. I guess one more thing I forgot is that the issues with the current mana situation is that it also punishes you for taking cast speed nodes. And punishing you for something that makes your build more fun is probably not a good idea overall. I haven't really thought about this too much, but it's the only conclusion I can make. Now, what kind of changes would I make personally? I think that Inspiration being elemental damage only is a super weird design choice. I have no idea what this is about. Now, I'm sure back in the day when mana was way easier to cheese, and with back in the day, I mean like literally 6 leagues ago, right? This wasn't really an issue. It was just like something you got on top on LE builds. But nowadays, Inspiration, a lot of these non-Archmage casters just feels mandatory. And a lot of these non-elemental casters actually die to mana cost. What I mean by that is, in order to facilitate the mana cost, you lose so much damage. So I would propose that either Inspiration becomes all damage. If necessary, you can maybe reduce the damage bonus a little bit if you think it's just going to be too good across the board. But honestly, there's a lot of fringe builds that would need this in order to sustain the mana. Or remove Inspiration and rework mana regen values. In general, a lot of builds would not use Inspiration if it wasn't for the mana part. So if they can now figure out the mana regen values without it, and it's reworked, then they get a payoff for it. So for example, if you pay like 6 points, all of a sudden you're going to actually get something else, right? You're going to get more damage. Like for example, in my build, I can use Spell Echo, which is 44% more damage versus Inspiration, which was only 28. And I get a payoff for that, but that is only possible if something changes there. Now, if we put all of this into a short conclusion, you should take away from this video that finding a way to circumvent your mana cost right now, instead of trying to fix it with points, is incredibly efficient. And I'm saying this because I feel like some people do not realize what the alternative to their EB or their Mana Flask or them going Blood Magic or them having an Archmage basically fix the mana cost for you, actually how much of an advantage that actually is. You have to gimp your build to play it, so make it worthwhile. If you actually want to go for a build that has to fix their mana the normal way, better make sure it's worth it. That's it. And if you want to be efficient, you probably want to fall into one of these first 5 categories. But that's about all I got to say. My internet was a little bit shitty recently, so I couldn't really make as much content as I wanted to. We're definitely back though with a build that I hope will turn out. Even if it sucks, I'll still make a video about it because I think it's a cool concept. But with that being said, since I still don't have a slogan, see you next time.